I was never meant to see Three-Eye Atlas. They say curiosity killed the cat. What they don't tell you is what happens to the person who keeps digging after the cat is already dead. What happens when you find the thing you were never supposed to find, when you see the document that was never supposed to exist, when you speak the name that was never supposed to be spoken. You don't die. That would be too merciful. Instead, you live with the knowledge that something is watching you, has always been watching you, and now knows that you know. This is my story. This is how I found Three-Eye Atlas, and this is why I can never stop looking over my shoulder. Before we go any further, a big thank you to Lonely Lost for the story idea. If you have any story ideas, make sure to comment them below. Now let's begin the beginning. Freedom of information. Request. My name is Marcus Webb, and in late October of the year 2021, I was a former investigative journalist trying to find my way back into a career that had chewed me up and spit me out. I had spent the better part of a decade covering conflicts in the Middle East, embedded with troops, documenting war crimes, interviewing refugees who had lost everything. The work had destroyed my marriage, cost me my mental health, and eventually, when I published a story that made the wrong people uncomfortable, it cost me my job at the newspaper. My ex-wife, Jennifer, used to tell me I was addicted to the truth the way other people were addicted to drugs. She said I couldn't let things go, that I always had to dig one layer deeper, ask one more question, chase one more lead. She was right, of course. That addiction is what led me to spend our anniversary in a bombed-out hospital in Aleppo, instead of at the restaurant she had booked 6 months in advance. It's what led me to miss her father's funeral because I was tracking down a source in Kabul. And it's ultimately what led her to pack her bags one Tuesday morning while I was asleep, and leave nothing but a note that said, "You're married to the story, Marcus, not to me." That was in 2019. By 2021, I was freelancing from a cramped apartment in Arlington, Virginia, taking whatever work I could get. Mostly fluff pieces for online magazines, the occasional corporate blog post, nothing that required me to actually think or investigate. I was treading water, waiting for something to remind me why I had become a journalist in the first place. That something came in the form of the Pentagon UAP hearings. I had watched them with casual interest, the way everyone else had. Unidentified aerial phenomena, they called them now, not UFOs. That term was too loaded, too tinfoil hat for the modern era. The hearings were carefully orchestrated, with military officials admitting that yes, there were things in the sky they could not explain, and yes, they took them seriously. It was historic in a strange, anticlimactic way. Disclosure without actually disclosing anything meaningful. But it got me thinking. If they were willing to admit this much publicly, what were they still hiding? I decided to file a Freedom of Information Act request. Nothing ambitious, just a fishing expedition to see what I could pull up. I requested all documents related to UAP incidents that had been reported by military personnel between January of 2015 and December of 2020. I expected to get back a pile of heavily redacted junk, if I got anything at all. FOIA requests are a long game. You submit them knowing that months or even years might pass before you receive anything useful. To my surprise, I received a response within 6 weeks. The package arrived in a standard manila envelope, the kind government agencies use when they are trying to look official but not too official. Inside were roughly 200 pages of documents, most of them so heavily redacted that they were essentially black rectangles with a few scattered words visible here and there. Typical government stonewalling. I poured myself a coffee and started reading through them at my kitchen table, notepad beside me, pen in hand. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Incident reports with all the identifying details blacked out. Witness statements reduced to single visible sentences like "observed object" and "no conventional explanation." I was about to give up and toss the whole stack into a drawer when I noticed something odd. Every 5th or 6th page had a small stamp in the upper right corner, barely visible beneath the redaction marks. I held the page up to the light and squinted. It read, 3I Atlas, clearance restricted. I flipped through the stack again, this time looking specifically for that stamp. It appeared on maybe 30 of the 200 pages, always in the same place, always with the same phrasing. 3I/Atlas. What the hell was 3I? What was Atlas? I had covered enough classified material during my war reporting days to know that government agencies love their acronyms and code names, but I had never heard of 3I or Atlas in any context. I pulled out my laptop and started searching. Nothing. I tried every combination I could think of. 3I government program, 3I classification, 3I military, Atlas Pentagon, Atlas UAP, Atlas clearance. Every search came back empty or pointed me toward unrelated programs. There was an Atlas satellite program, an Atlas rocket system, even an Atlas particle detector at CERN, but nothing that matched the context of what I was seeing. Frustrated, I returned to the documents and kept reading. Most of them were useless, but then, buried near the bottom of the stack, I found something that made my hand stop mid-turn. It was a photocopy of a handwritten note on a sticky note, the kind of thing that should never have been included in a FOIA release. Someone had physically attached it to a document, and when that document was scanned for archival purposes, the note was scanned too. It was an accident, a bureaucratic slip-up. The note read, "Do not push public. Thrisias confirmed. Atlas referral." I read it 3 times, my heart rate picking up with each pass. This was not a classification. This was not a code name for a program. This was something else. This was a filter, a sorting mechanism. And whatever 3I meant, it was significant enough that certain cases were being referred to something called Atlas, and deliberately kept from public view. I spent the rest of that night searching for more information, but I came up empty. I needed a new angle. I needed to make the system think I already knew what 3I Atlas was. Act 1. The first break in the wall. It took me a week to craft the next FOIA request. I worded it very carefully, as if I were already familiar with the 3I Atlas designation. I submitted requests to multiple agencies, each one slightly different but all containing the same core assumption, that I was a researcher with appropriate clearance asking for routine information about an established classification system. It was a bluff, a calculated gamble. If 3I Atlas was real and bureaucratic enough, some low-level clerk might process my request without questioning whether I actually had the authority to ask for it. I submitted the requests on a Monday morning in the early December and tried not to obsess over them. I had other work to do, bills to pay, a life to pretend to live, but every day I checked my email a dozen times, waiting for something, anything to come back. The response arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks after I'd submitted the request. It was not the full document release I had asked for. Instead, it was a short email from a 4IA officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency. The officer's name was Rachel Klein, and her email was polite, bureaucratic, and absolutely chilling. "Mr. Webb," it began, "thank you for your inquiry regarding 3I Atlas classified materials. Unfortunately, I do not have the appropriate clearance level to process requests related to 3I Atlas designations. I have forwarded your request to the appropriate oversight office. Please allow additional time for review." I stared at the screen, reading and rereading those 2 sentences. She had confirmed it. 3I Atlas was real. It was not a typo, not a mistake, not some random code that I had misunderstood. It was a real classification system, one that required clearance above what a standard FOA officer possessed. My hands were shaking as I saved the email and printed a hard copy. This was the break I needed. This was proof. I immediately tried to reply to Rachel Klein, thanking her and asking if she could provide any additional context, but my email bounced back. Her address had been deactivated. I called the Dear Public Affairs office and asked to speak with her. The person on the other end of the line said there was no employee by that name in their system. I insisted, reading them the email address directly from the message I had received. They put me on hold for 5 minutes and then came back with the same answer. Rachel Klein did not exist. I hung up and sat in silence, staring at the printed email. She had existed 2 days ago. She had processed my request, sent me a response, and then vanished. Scrubbed from the system as if she had never been there at all. That was when I realised I was no longer playing a harmless game of bureaucratic cat and mouse. I had tripped something. I had asked the wrong question to the wrong person, and now someone somewhere was paying attention. But I couldn't stop. Jennifer's voice echoed in my head. "You're married to the story, Marcus." She was right then, and she would be right now. I had to know. Eked 2. Breaching the system. I needed help. I needed someone who understood how the intelligence community worked. Someone who could tell me whether I was being paranoid or whether I'd actually stumbled onto something dangerous. I scrolled through my old contacts, people I had worked with during my war reporting days. Most of them had moved on, taken jobs in the private sector or retired from the field altogether. But there was one name I kept coming back to, Lieutenant Commander James Ortiz, formerly of Naval Intelligence, now working as a consultant for a defence contractor in Maryland. I had met Ortiz during an embed in Afghanistan back in 2017. He was smart, cautious, and deeply cynical about the way the military handled classified information. We had stayed in touch over the years, exchanging the occasional email, meeting for coffee when we were both in the same city. He was one of the few people I trusted to tell me the truth, even if that truth was something I did not want to hear. But there was something else about Ortiz, something I had never told anyone. During that embed, we had witnessed something together. It was 3 a.m, and we were stationed at a forward operating base in Helmand province. I had stepped outside the command tent to get some air, and Ortiz was there, smoking a cigarette and staring at the sky. And then we both saw it. A light, moving in patterns that made no physical sense. Sharp 90-degree turns at impossible speeds. Complete stops mid-flight, hovering for several seconds. Then acceleration that should have generated sonic booms but produced no sound at all. We watched it for maybe 5 minutes before it simply vanished. We never spoke about it. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. It was an unspoken agreement, the kind of thing you pretend didn't happen because acknowledging it would mean confronting something your brain isn't equipped to process. But now I needed to break that silence. I sent him an encrypted message through a secure app we had used before, asking if we could meet in person. He responded within an hour. Tomorrow, usual place. Come alone. The usual place was a diner in Bethesda, a kind of anonymous chain, restaurant where nobody paid attention to anybody else. I arrived early, ordered coffee and waited. Ortiz walked in exactly on time, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, looking like any other middle-aged guy grabbing lunch. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes swept the room before he sat down. He was scared. He slid into the booth across from me and did not waste time with pleasantries. "What have you gotten yourself into, Marcus?" I pulled out the printed email from Rachel Klein and slid it across the table. He read it, his expression unreadable, and then looked up at me. "Where did you get this?" "FOIA request. I asked about 3i Atlas. 2 days later, the officer who responded to me vanished from the system." Ortiz folded the paper and handed it back to me. He looked around the diner, checking to see if anyone was paying attention, and then leaned in close. "You need to stop. I need to understand what this is. No, Marcus, you need to stop right now. Walk away from this and never mention it again." I leaned forward, matching his intensity. "James, Afghanistan, 2017, 3 a.m, you remember." His face went pale. For a moment I thought he might get up and walk out. But instead he closed his eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. "I knew you were going to bring that up eventually," he said quietly. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 5 years. Then you know I can't walk away. Not now." He was silent for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If you ever see 3i on a document, it means the object was intelligent, maneuvering with intent and aware of being observed. It is not a project. It is a designation. It means the thing you saw was not just flying. It was thinking. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. So what we saw that night would have been flagged as 3i, yes. And they know. The military, the government. They know these things are intelligent. The government knows a lot of things it does not tell you. 3i is not something they talk about publicly. Because once you admit that something out there is intelligent and aware, you have to start answering very uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what does it want? Why is it here? And what happens if it decides to stop playing nice? What about Atlas? Ortiz shook his head. I do not know what Atlas is. I have heard the name, but only in passing. It is above my clearance, way above. But I can tell you this. If something gets flagged as 3i and referred to Atlas, it means someone very high up decided the case needed special handling. It means the public will never hear about it. James, I need to know more. I need to understand why they're hiding this. He reached across the table and grabbed my wrist, his grip tight enough to hurt. Listen to me very carefully. After that night in Afghanistan, I was debriefed. 3 men in the civilian clothes showed up at the base the next morning and pulled me into a room. They asked me what I saw. I told them the truth. And then they showed me photographs. Photographs of what? Of people. Dozens of them. People who had reported similar sightings. People who had asked too many questions. People who had tried to go public. And next to each photograph was a date. The date they died. The date they disappeared. Or the date they recanted their story and were never heard from again. His hand was trembling now. They didn't threaten me, Marcus. They didn't have to. They just showed me those photographs and said, this is what happens to people who cannot let things go. Then they walked out, and I never saw them again. But I got the message. Are you telling me they kill people over this? I am telling you that people who dig into 3i have a very bad habit of experiencing sudden accidents, mental breakdowns, or complete reversals where they claim they made everything up. I'm telling you that Rachel Klein is probably fine, probably reassigned to some other department under a different name, but she will never work in F4EA again. And I am telling you that if you keep digging, you will end up in one of those photographs. I pulled my hand back, my mind racing. What if I told you I can't stop? What if I told you that this is the first thing in 2 years that has made me feel alive, that has reminded me why I became a journalist in the first place? Ortiz stared at me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like pity. Then I would say, your ex-wife was right about you. You're addicted to the truth, and like any addict, you're going to keep chasing it until it kills you. He stood up, dropped a 20 on the table for his untouched coffee, and paused before leaving. One more thing, he said, not looking at me. That night in Afghanistan, I filed a report the next morning before the debrief. Standard incident report, just documenting what we saw. When I checked my file a week later, that report was gone. Completely scrubbed from the system. It was like it never existed. What are you saying? I am saying that if Atlas decides your story does not fit their narrative, they will erase it. And they are very good at erasing things. He walked out without another word. I sat there for a long time, staring at the $20 bill on the table. Ortiz was scared. I had seen him in war zones, under fire, making life and death decisions without flinching. But this terrified him. That should have been enough to make me stop, but it was not, because now I knew something else. I knew that what we had seen that night in Afghanistan was real, was documented, and had been deliberately erased. And if they could erase that, what else had they erased? I thought about Jennifer again, about all the stories I had chased, all the leads I had followed, all the times I had chosen the truth over everything else in my life. She had left because she knew I would never stop. She knew I would sacrifice anything for the story, and she was right. Act 3. The breakthrough and the trap. Over the next month, I became obsessed. I set up alerts for any mention of 3i or Atlas in leaked documents, declassified files, anything I could find. I joined obscure forums where former intelligence officers traded stories under pseudonyms. I read everything I could about UAP incidents, looking for patterns, looking for cases that might have been flagged as 3i. But I also started thinking about Los Angeles, about September 9th, 2016, about the night I had been there. I called my old friend Trevor, the one whose rooftop I had been on that night. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but he picked up on the third ring. "Marcus? Holy shit, man. Long time." "Hey Trevor, listen, I need to ask you something. Do you remember September 2016, when I visited you in Pasadena?" There was a pause. "Yeah, of course. That was a fun weekend." "Do you remember anything unusual happening that weekend?" Another pause, longer this time. "Unusual how?" "Like, I don't know. Anything strange in the news? Anything weird people were talking about?" "Marcus, are you okay? You sound paranoid." "Just humour me. Do you remember anything?" "No, man. It was a normal weekend. We drank beer, caught up, talked about your divorce. Nothing unusual at all." My stomach dropped. "Trevor, we were on your rooftop when it happened. We saw it. The thing in the sky. You don't remember that?" Silence. "Trevor, I think you might be confusing that trip with something else, Marcus. We stayed inside that whole weekend because I was getting over a cold. We watched movies and ordered pizza. That's it." I felt cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. "That's not what happened. We were on your roof. There were people in the street pointing at the sky. A massive object, completely silent, just hovering there." "Marcus, I think you need to talk to someone. Like, professionally. That did not happen." "You're telling me you have no memory of that night?" "I am telling you that what you are describing did not happen. Look, I really need to go. Take care of yourself, okay?" He hung up before I could respond. I sat there, phone in hand, trying to process what had just happened. Trevor had been there. He had seen it. We had watched it together. And now he had no memory of it at all. Neural dampening successful. That's what the file had said. No mainstream retention. They hadn't just suppressed the story. They had suppressed the memory. Somehow, they had made thousands of people forget what they had seen. And it had worked so perfectly that even someone who had been standing right next to me, someone I trusted completely, had no recollection of an event that had definitely happened. I felt like I was losing my mind. But I had proof. I had the files. I had the documentation. It was real. I needed more evidence. I needed something concrete that could not be dismissed or explained away. That's when I got lucky. Or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. A friend of a friend, someone who worked as an IT contractor for a defence subcontractor, mentioned in passing that one of the databases he maintained had been breached in a ransomware attack. The breach had been contained, but not before a partial mirror of the database had been copied and leaked online. The leak was small, technical, and of no interest to most people, but he thought I might find it interesting. He sent me a link to a file-sharing site where the leaked data had been posted. It was not the full database, just an inventory. A massive spreadsheet listing case files, reference numbers, dates, and status codes. No actual documents, just metadata. But that was enough. I downloaded the file and opened it on my laptop, my heart pounding as the spreadsheet loaded. There were thousands of entries, maybe tens of thousands. I used the search function to filter by the term 3i. The results made my stomach drop. There were hundreds of entries flagged as 3i verified. Each one included a brief description, a location, a date, and a status update. I scrolled through them, my eyes scanning the descriptions. Jacksonville flyover, July 20th, 2019. Multiple military witnesses. Neural dampening successful. No mainstream retention. Phoenix Lights recurrence, March 15th, 2018. Mass public observation. Atlas intervention. Media suppression effective. Atlantic Ocean encounter, November 3rd, 2020. USS Kid crew interaction. 3i confirmed. Human presence acknowledged. Full debrief under Atlas protocols. I kept scrolling, my hands trembling, until I found an entry that stopped me cold. Los Angeles flyover, September 9th, 2016. Mass public observation. Neural dampening successful. No mainstream retention. There it was. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that what I remembered had actually happened. But then I saw something else. Something that made my hands freeze on the keyboard. There was another entry dated just 2 weeks earlier. Helmand Province, Afghanistan, March 7th, 2017. FOB observation. Military personnel 3I confirmed. Witnesses debriefed. Incident report eliminated. Atlas referral complete. Ortiz and I. That was us. That was our sighting. And it was right there in the database. Documented, classified, and deliberately hidden. I kept scrolling, searching for anything else that might be relevant. And that's when I found the entry that changed everything. Arlington, Virginia, December 21st, 2021. Residential observation, single witness, 3I potential. Subject M. Webb. Monitoring initiated. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading the entry. December 21st. That was yesterday. They weren't just watching the sky. They were watching me. And according to this file, something had been observed in Arlington. Near my apartment. Something potentially classified as 3I. I hadn't seen anything. Not yesterday, not any day recently. But according to this file, something had been there. Something intelligent and aware. And it had been watching me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I searched my own name in the database. 3 more entries appeared. Subject M. Webb. FOIA request intercepted. 3I Atlas terminology detected. Monitoring escalated. Subject M. Webb. Contact with J. Ortiz confirmed. Both parties under observation. Atlas protocols engaged. Subject M. Webb. Database access detected. Immediate intervention required. Neural dampening candidate. The last entry was dated today. Time-stamped 2 hours ago. Neural dampening candidate. They were going to make me forget. Just like Trevor. Just like everyone in Los Angeles. Just like everyone who had ever seen something they weren't supposed to see. I copied the entire spreadsheet onto 3 different external hard drives and deleted it from my laptop. I cleared my browser history, wiped my cache, and restarted my computer. I was being paranoid, but paranoia felt justified now. I grabbed my notebook and started writing everything down by hand. Every detail, every date, every entry I had found. If they were going to erase my memory, I was going to leave myself a trail of breadcrumbs. Some way to find my way back to the truth. But even as I wrote, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. That whatever was coming, whatever they were planning to do to me, was already in motion. I thought about calling Jennifer, about warning her, telling her everything, asking her to help me document this before they took it away. But what would I even say? Hi, remember how you left me because I was obsessed with stories? Well, I found one that might actually get me killed or mind-wiped, and I need you to be my backup memory. She would think I had finally snapped. Maybe I had. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about that entry. Arlington, Virginia, residential observation, single witness. Something had been there, near my apartment watching me. Something intelligent and aware. And I had not even seen it. Or had I? I tried to remember the previous day, December 21st. I'd woken up late, worked on a freelance article about electric vehicles, ordered takeout for dinner. A completely normal, forgettable day. Except there had been a moment around dusk. I had been sitting at my desk when I felt an overwhelming urge to look out the window. Not just a casual glance, but a physical compulsion, like someone was calling my name. I'd stood up, walked to the window and looked outside. Nothing. Just the parking lot, the street, the row of buildings across the way. Everything normal. But I had stood there for several minutes staring, feeling like something was wrong. feeling like something was watching me, and then the feeling had passed, and I'd gone back to work and forgotten about it completely. Until now, what if something had been there? What if I had seen it, but somehow failed to consciously register it? Or what if I had seen it, and the neural dampening had already started, already begun erasing the memory before it could fully form? I went to the window now in the darkness and looked outside. The parking lot was empty, the street was quiet, everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, right now, in this moment. I closed the blinds and went back to my desk, my heart pounding. Act 4. The moment they realise they cannot unsee it. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days later, on Christmas Eve. I was sitting in my living room working on a freelance article about renewable energy when I heard a faint scratching sound. It was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. I looked up and realised it was coming from my television. The TV was off, or at least it should have been. The screen was black, but there was a faint glow around the edges, and the scratching sound continued. As I stared at it, the screen flickered to life, displaying the manufacturer's boot logo. It stayed there for a moment, and then the screen went black again. I walked over and unplugged it from the wall. The screen stayed dark, but the scratching sound continued for another few seconds before finally stopping. I stood there, staring at the dead television, my heart pounding. TVs did not turn themselves on. They especially did not turn themselves on after being unplugged. I grabbed my phone to do a quick search about whether this was a known glitch, but before I could type anything, the screen went black. A second later, it displayed the Apple logo and began a factory reset sequence. I had not initiated a reset. I had not even unlocked the phone. I watched, helpless, as the phone wiped itself clean, erasing years of photos, messages, contacts, everything. When it finally finished, it displayed the setup screen as if it were brand new out of the box. I turned it off and set it on the table, my hands shaking. This was not a coincidence. This was not a glitch. I went to my laptop and tried to connect to my Wi-Fi network. It prompted me to re-enter the password, which was strange because I had been connected just minutes ago. When I entered the password, it rejected it. I tried again, thinking I'd mistyped. Rejected again. I checked my router and found that it reset itself. But when I logged into the settings, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The network name had changed. It was no longer the default name I had set years ago. Instead, it now read Federal Resilience Gateway, Node 7. I refreshed the page, thinking it had to be some kind of display error. But it stayed the same. My home network, my private internet connection, had been rerouted through something called a Federal Resilience Gateway. I unplugged the router and sat in the dark, trying to process what was happening. My TV had rebooted itself. My phone had wiped itself. My internet had been hijacked. These were not accidents. These were deliberate actions, coordinated and precise. Someone was inside my system. Someone was watching me. I grabbed a notebook and a pen, the old-fashioned kind that could not be hacked or monitored, and started writing everything down. Every detail, every date, every document I had found. If they were going to erase me digitally, I was going to make sure there was a paper trail. Around 2 a.m, my laptop chimed with an incoming email notification. I had not opened my email program. I had not even turned the laptop on. But there it was, screen glowing in the darkness. I approached it slowly as if it might explode. The email was already open, displaying a single message from an address I did not recognise. No subject line, no signature, just a single sentence. 3i is not a project, it is a handshake protocol. If you see it, it has already seen you. I stared at the screen, reading the message over and over, my mind racing. A handshake protocol, a two-way communication. It was not just the government watching these objects, the objects were watching back. And now, because I had dug too deep, because I had seen the name and spoken the words and pulled on the thread. They were watching me too. But then something else appeared on the screen. The email was updating in real time, new text appearing letter by letter as if someone was typing it directly. You want to know what Atlas does, Marcus? It maintains equilibrium. It ensures that humanity's awareness expands at a controlled pace. Not too fast, not too slow. Just enough to prevent panic. Just enough to prevent intervention. I should have closed the laptop. I should have thrown it across the room. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The phenomenon you call 3i has been observing your species for longer than your recorded history. It does not invade. It does not conquer. It observes. It waits. It measures your readiness. And when individuals like you begin to notice, begin to pull on the threads, begin to ask the right questions, Atlas steps in, not to silence you, to prepare you. Prepare me for what? I found myself typing the question before I could stop myself. The response came immediately. For the realization that you are not ready, that your species is still too fragmented, too volatile, too afraid of the unknown to handle the truth. You want disclosure, Marcus. Disclosure would destroy you. It would shatter every power structure, every religious framework, every sense of humanity's place in the cosmos. Atlas exists to prevent that collapse, to manage the transition, to ensure that when the time comes, you will be ready. And what if I go public with what I know? You won't. Because part of you already understands. Part of you has always understood. This is not a cover-up, Marcus. This is a mercy. We could erase your memory right now. We have that capability, but we are not going to. Because you serve a purpose. You and people like you. The seekers. The truth-tellers. The ones who cannot let go. You push the boundaries of collective awareness. You force the conversation forward. And when enough people like you exist, when enough of humanity is asking the right questions, that is when the equilibrium shifts. That is when readiness is achieved. So you're saying I'm being used? We're all being used, Marcus. You by your need for truth, us by our mandate to observe, them by their nature to watch and wait. The only question that matters is whether you can live with the knowledge you now possess, whether you can carry this weight without breaking, whether you can continue to seek the truth knowing that the truth is not meant to set you free. It is meant to prepare you for a reality you cannot yet comprehend. The typing stopped. The screen went black, and then slowly my laptop powered down on its own. I sat there in the darkness, my mind reeling. Was that real? Had I just had a conversation with Atlas? Or had I imagined the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? I looked down at my hands and realised they were shaking. I realised I was crying and had no memory of when the tears had started. Jennifer's voice echoed in my head again. You're married to the story, Marcus. But what if the story didn't want me? What if the truth wasn't something I could possess, but something that possessed me? Act 5. The weight of knowing. The days after Christmas blurred together. I stopped sleeping properly. I stopped eating regular meals. I would sit at my kitchen table for hours, surrounded by printouts and handwritten notes, trying to make sense of what had happened. I tried to reach Ortiz again, but his number was disconnected. I tried to find him online, but his LinkedIn profile had been deleted, his social media account scrubbed. It was as if he had never existed. I thought about going to the media, about taking everything I had to a major news outlet. But every time I tried to organise the material, I realised how insane it all sounded. A stamp on classified documents, a vanished FOIA officer, an email conversation with an AI or entity claiming to be Atlas, a database entry about me being monitored. Without Trevor's corroboration of the Los Angeles event, without Ortiz to verify the Afghanistan sighting, without Rachel Klein to confirm the email she sent, I had nothing. Just the word of a disgraced journalist with a history of obsessive behaviour and a failed marriage. They had been right. I couldn't go public because no one would believe me. But I also couldn't stop. I spent every day searching for new information, new connections, new pieces of the puzzle, and slowly, carefully, I began to find them. There were others, hidden in the corners of the internet, posting under pseudonyms, sharing fragments of stories that matched my own. A former Air Force technician who claimed to have seen the 3CI designation on radar logs before they were classified. A retired CIA analyst who mentioned Atlas in a podcast interview before the episode was mysteriously pulled offline. A physicist who published a paper about mass memory suppression technology before recanting the entire thing and checking himself into a psychiatric facility. The pattern was clear. People found pieces of the truth, tried to share it, and then either disappeared, recanted, or were dismissed as mentally unstable. I was next. I knew that. The only question was which path I would take. One night in mid-January, I was jolted awake by a sound outside my window. Not the scratching this time, something else. A low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I got up and went to the window, my heart pounding. I opened the blinds slowly, expecting to see nothing like always. But this time, there was something there. A light. Not in the sky, but right outside my building. Hovering maybe 20 feet off the ground, perfectly still. It was not bright enough to illuminate the parking lot, but I could see it clearly. A sphere of pale blue light, about the size of a car, with a surface that seemed to ripple like water. I watched it for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. And as I watched, I felt something. A presence. An awareness. It was looking at me. Not with eyes, not with sensors, but with something else. Something I had no words for. I was not afraid. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt a strange sense of calm, of recognition, as if this moment had always been inevitable. And then, without warning, the light vanished. Not gradually, not by flying away. It simply ceased to exist, like someone had flipped a switch. I stood at the window for a long time after that, waiting for it to return, but it did not. The next morning I checked my notebook. I had written about the light, described it in detail, recorded the time and date. But as I read my own words, they seemed strange to me, foreign, as if someone else had written them. I tried to remember the previous night. Had I really seen something, or had I dreamed it? I could not be sure anymore. That was when I understood what they were doing. They were not going to erase my memory completely. They were going to make me doubt it. They were going to blur the line between reality and imagination until I could no longer trust my own mind. And it was working. The last safe entry, offline and watched. That was 2 months ago. Since then, I have stopped using my phone except for the most basic functions. I have stopped using my laptop for anything other than work I do not care about. Write everything down by hand now, in notebooks I keep hidden in places I will not mention here. I do not know if this document will ever be read by anyone other than me. I do not know if sharing this story will make any difference. But I need to write it down, if only to prove to myself that it happened, that I am not losing my mind. Atlas is not watching the sky. It is watching the people who notice what is in the sky. There are others like me. I know this because I have found traces of them online, in deleted forum posts and archived blog entries that vanish as quickly as they appear. People who ask the wrong questions, people who see the stamp, people who speak the name. Some of them stop posting. Some of them recant, claiming they made it all up, that they were confused or mistaken. Some of them simply disappear. I do not think they kill us. That would be too obvious, too messy. I think they do something worse. They discredit us. They isolate us. They make it so that even if we scream the truth from the rooftops, no one will believe us. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the greatest cover-up is not hiding the truth. Maybe it is hiding the truth in plain sight and making sure that anyone who sees it is dismissed as a lunatic. I still do not know what 3i really means, Not fully. I do not know what Atlas does with the cases it collects. I do not know what the objects want or why they're here or what it means that they are intelligent and aware. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. They see us. They have always seen us. And now that I have seen them, they see me too. I think about Jennifer sometimes, about what she said before she left. You're married to the story, Marcus. She was right. But what she did not understand, what I did not understand until now, is that some stories marry you back. Some truths, once you find them, never let you go. I am writing this in a coffee shop on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, using a public computer that I will never use again. I will print this out, store it somewhere safe, and hope that someday someone else will find it. Someone who is asking the same questions I asked. Someone who sees the same stamp I saw. If that person is you, I have only one piece of advice, and it is not what you think. Do not stop. Yes, it is dangerous. Yes, it will cost you. Yes, you might end up like me, isolated and paranoid and unable to tell the difference between reality and manipulation. But if you stop, if you walk away, if you let the fear win, then they have succeeded. Then the truth stays buried, and the equilibrium they talk about remains unchanged. We are the ones who push the boundaries of collective awareness. We are the ones who force the conversation forward. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us keep digging, keep questioning, keep refusing to forget, we will reach that critical mass they talked about. That moment when humanity is finally ready. I do not know what happens after that. I do not know if disclosure will save us or destroy us. But I know that we deserve to find out. We deserve to know the truth about what is sharing this planet, this solar system, this universe with us. Even if that truth changes everything, the scratching has started again. I can hear it through the noise of the coffee shop, faint but persistent. It is coming from the computer screen in front of me. I need to finish this now. If you are reading this, know that it is real. All of it. The stamp, the files, the objects that think and watch and know. Atlas is not a myth. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is real. And it is still running, still sorting, still deciding which truths the public is allowed to know and which truths must be buried. And if you ever see that stamp, if you ever find a document marked 3I, you will have a choice to make. You can walk away, forget what you saw, live your life in comfortable ignorance. Or you can do what I did. You can pull on the thread and see where it leads. But know this, the thread pulls back. I am logging off now. I'm going to print this, walk out of this coffee shop, and disappear for a while. Maybe I will resurface in a few months. Maybe I will not. But if I do not, if I vanish the way Rachel Klein vanished, if my name gets scrubbed from every system and every record, then let this document be proof that I was here, that I saw the truth, and that I tried to share it. My name is Marcus Webb. I was an investigative journalist. I found something I was never meant to find. I saw something I was never meant to see. And now it has found me. The last thing I want to say is this. I do not regret it. Despite everything, despite the fear and the paranoia and the isolation, I do not regret digging. Because for the first time in years, I feel like I am doing what I was meant to do. I am uncovering the truth. I am asking the questions that need to be asked. Jennifer was right. I am married to the story. But maybe that is not a flaw. Maybe that is exactly what the world needs. People who cannot let go. People who keep digging even when they are told to stop. People who see the truth and refuse to look away. We are the seekers, the truth tellers, the ones who push the boundaries. And maybe, just maybe, we are the ones who will change everything. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in classified files, but buried in plain sight, in the footnotes of forgotten academic papers? What if the government's most classified unit wasn't studying aliens at all, but something far more terrifying? Something that's been manipulating human belief since the dawn of civilization itself. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a shout out to Jeffernan 1772 for suggesting this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep sleep theories going, so please drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about the Collins Elite, and why they might be the most important government program you've never heard of. I wasn't looking for UFOs, I was looking for a way to pay rent. The gig economy had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I cared to count. Web design, freelance writing, even a brief stint delivering food, nothing stuck. But when Dr. Martinelli at the university offered me work as a research assistant, scanning old theological dissertations for the digital archive, I jumped at it. $25 an hour to sit in a quiet library basement, copying dusty Latin passages and obscure biblical references that nobody had touched in decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The work was mind-numbing mostly. Endless pages of theological debates from the 1950s and 60s, written by seminary students who are probably dead by now. The Augustinian interpretation of angelic hierarchies, post-war perspectives on demonic manifestation, scriptural analysis of divine intervention in modern context. Heavy stuff, but about as exciting as watching paint dry. I'd been at it for 3 months when I found the reference that changed everything. It was October, around 2 a.m. I was halfway through a 1963 thesis titled Angelic Manifestations in Modern Times, 324 pages of dense theological argumentation by a seminarian named Marcus Whitmore. The kind of paper that made me question every life choice that had led me to that basement. I was scanning page 187, a particularly dry section about contemporary witness testimony, when a footnote caught my eye. It wasn't the content that stopped me, it was the context. The main text was discussing reports of luminous beings witnessed by various clergy members throughout the 1950s. Standard religious stuff, the kind of mystical experiences that show up in seminary papers all the time. But the footnote read, "For governmental perspective on similar phenomena, see Collins Elite Memorandum 1957, classification status unknown." I stared at that line for a full minute. It was cited like a real source, with the matter-of-fact tone of academic reference. No explanation, no context, just there. The problem was, this wasn't a section about government or politics. It was about angels. And the thesis was written by a seminary student, not a political science major. So why was he referencing what sounded like a classified government document in the middle of a paper about divine manifestations? I made a note and kept scanning, but the reference nagged at me. Collins Elite. It sounded official, maybe military. But why would a religious scholar in 1963 have access to classified material? And why would he cite it so casually, as if his readers would know what he was talking about? The next day, I couldn't concentrate on my assigned documents. Instead, I found myself searching the university's digital catalogue for any mention of Collins Elite. Nothing came up in the main database, but I had access to some of the restricted theological archives through Dr. Martinelli's login credentials. That's where I found the second reference. It was in a 1959 lecture transcript from a Catholic seminary in Maryland. The speaker was Father Benedict Toretti, discussing unusual spiritual encounters in the post-war era. Most of the lecture was standard theological fare, but near the end, during what appeared to be an informal Q&A session, someone asked about government interest in religious phenomena. Father Toretti's response was brief but loaded. There are those in Washington who understand that not all mysteries can be solved with science. The Collins Elite represents a different approach to certain questions, but we must be careful not to mistake understanding for wisdom or documentation for truth. The transcript noted uncomfortable silence after this comment, and the lecture ended shortly thereafter. 2 references, 2 religious contexts, both suggesting that Collins' elite was some kind of government program dealing with spiritual or supernatural phenomena. But why were religious scholars the only ones talking about it? And why did they all seem nervous about it? I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the theological archives. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Collins' elite didn't show up in UFO journals or conspiracy magazines. It didn't appear in scientific papers or military histories. Instead, it haunted the footnotes of religious documents like a ghost that only clergy could see. A 1958 exorcism report from a priest in New Mexico mentioned consultation with Collins' elite regarding non-terrestrial influences. A 1962 seminary paper on demonic deception in the modern age included a cryptic reference to Collins' elite protocols for distinguishing spiritual from extraplanetary phenomena. A 1961 lecture on comparative religion contained a single chilling line. As the Collins elite has documented, the same entities that once appeared as gods now masquerade as visitors from the stars. Each reference was brief, almost coded, like the authors were speaking to an audience that would understand the implications without needing explanation. And always, the references appeared in contexts dealing with the supernatural, the spiritual, the otherworldly, but never in the way you'd expect. These weren't discussions of government cover-ups or alien conspiracies. They were warnings, theological warnings about deception, about false prophets, about entities that wore whatever mask humanity was willing to believe. I was starting to get a picture of something much stranger than a typical black project. Collins' elite wasn't studying UFOs the way the Air Force was. They were studying them the way the Catholic Church studied demons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a misfiled document. I was scanning a collection of 1964 seminary papers when I found something that didn't belong. Mixed in with discussions of Vatican II reforms and modern catechism was a single-page document that looked nothing like the others. It was typed on official letterhead, something called Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena, and dated March 15th, 1959. The document was brief. Memo. Regarding recent Collins Elite Briefing 2, member institutions from Council Secretary following last week's presentation by Dr. Edward Collins regarding non-corporeal intelligence manifestations. The Council recommends the following protocols for clergy encountering anomalous phenomena. Do not assume extraterrestrial origin 2. Apply traditional discernment practices 3. Document all encounters per Collins Elite Guidelines 4. Report suspected deception campaigns immediately. Remember, the same entities that demanded worship as Baal and Moloch now request our trust as benevolent space brothers. The mask changes, the deception remains constant. Father Michael Torino, Council Secretary. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't just a reference to Collins' elite. This was evidence of direct collaboration between the program and religious institutions. They were briefing clergy on how to handle UFO encounters, but from a theological perspective. And that last paragraph, it was suggesting that UFO entities weren't aliens at all. They were something much older and more dangerous, masquerading as extraterrestrials just as they had once masqueraded as ancient gods. I photographed the document with my phone and started digging into this interdenominational council. What I found made my blood run cold. The Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena existed from 1957 to 1969, according to what little I could find. Its membership included representatives from major Christian denominations, Jewish religious authorities, and even some Islamic scholars. The council was supposedly formed to coordinate religious response to unusual phenomena in the post-war era. That was the official line anyway. The reality appeared to be much more specific. I found meeting minutes from 1958 that discussed the Collins Elite presentation on entity communication patterns. A 1960 report mentioned successful implementation of Collins Elite discernment protocols in 17 states. A 1962 memorandum warned of increased entity activity coinciding with popular UFO narratives. The council wasn't just studying religious phenomena in general, they were specifically focused on what they called entity encounters, and they were working directly with Collins' elite to develop responses. The most disturbing document I found was a 1961 report titled Spiritual Warfare in the Space Age. It outlined what the council believed to be a deliberate deception campaign by non-human entities. Historical analysis suggests consistent behavioural patterns across millennia. Entities appearing as divine beings in ancient times demanded worship, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. Modern manifestations as space visitors request trust, cooperation, and technological exchange. The underlying objective, human subjugation, remains unchanged. The report went on to detail specific cases where UFO contactees had reported entities claiming to be from various star systems, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient religious texts describing demonic deception. According to the council's analysis, the entities were running the same con they'd always run. They just updated their costumes for each era. As I dug deeper into the council's documents, I started to notice something unsettling. My research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. Dr. Martinelli mentioned that someone had been asking about my work. Just routine monitoring, he said, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Then I noticed that some of the documents I'd photographed were being moved to different sections of the archive. Files that had been easily accessible suddenly required special permission to view. The final warning came on a Tuesday night in November. I was alone in the archive basement scanning a particularly interesting 1963 document about Collins Elite Field Operations, when my computer screen flickered. The document disappeared, replaced by a simple text message. "Stop looking, they're not what you think." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone was monitoring my research in real time. Someone with access to the university's network, and probably a lot more than that. I should have stopped then. Any reasonable person would have backed off, found a different job, maybe moved to a different city. But I wasn't reasonable anymore. I was obsessed. And besides, whoever was watching had just confirmed that I was onto something real. I replied by typing into the same text box that had appeared on my screen. "Then what are they?" The response came immediately. "They've worn every mask we've ever worshipped." The screen flickered again and the message disappeared. But the implication was crystal clear. Collins' elite wasn't just studying UFO entities. They'd concluded that these entities were the same beings that had manipulated human religious belief throughout history. Ancient gods, modern aliens, same entities, different costumes. After the warning, access to documents became nearly impossible. Files went missing. Archives were suddenly under renovation. Dr. Martinelli stopped returning my emails. It was clear that my research had triggered some kind of response from whoever wanted Collins' elite to remain buried. But I'd already seen enough to piece together the broad outline of their doctrine. Collins' elite appeared to be a small classified unit within the US government that approached the UFO phenomenon from a religious rather than scientific perspective. Based on the scattered evidence I'd found, their core beliefs seemed to be UFO entities were not extraterrestrial visitors. They were the same non-corporeal beings that had interacted with humans throughout history. These entities had consistently masqueraded as whatever humans were most likely to worship or trust. Their ultimate goal was the spiritual subjugation of humanity. The modern UFO phenomenon was simply their latest deception campaign. The unit apparently worked closely with religious leaders to develop protocols for identifying and resisting entity influence. They studied religious texts not for historical interest, but for tactical intelligence about entity behaviour patterns. They viewed exorcists and clergy as frontline personnel in a spiritual war that most people didn't even know was happening. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe they were losing. My research into Collins' elite had taken nearly 6 months, and by December I was running out of leads. The documents had dried up, my access was severely restricted, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find anything more concrete than footnotes and oblique references. That's when I decided to look at modern UFO phenomena through the Collins Elite lens. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Contemporary UFO contactee reports, when examined from a religious perspective, showed the same patterns that Collins Elite had apparently identified in the 1950s. Entities claiming to be from Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient Gnostic texts. Space brothers, preaching salvation through technological advancement, using language that echoed Mesopotamian religious propaganda. Abduction experiences that followed the same psychological patterns as historical demonic possession cases. The modern UFO disclosure movement, viewed through Collins Elite's framework, looked less like a quest for scientific truth and more like the latest phase of an ancient deception campaign. Entities that had once demanded worship as gods now requested trust as benevolent aliens. Same control mechanisms, updated for a scientific age. I started to understand why Collins Elite had worked so closely with religious authorities. If you believe that UFO entities were actually spiritual beings with thousands of years of experience in manipulating human belief systems, then scientists and military analysts were the wrong people to study them. You needed theologians. You needed people who understood the long history of spiritual deception and the psychological mechanisms of faith. You needed people who could recognize the same lie being told with new words. I thought I'd reached the end of my research when I received an unexpected email in January. The sender was listed as archive.recovery@gmail.com, obviously a throwaway account. The message was brief. You've been asking the right questions. Roommate 47 basement level manuscript collection. Look behind the Milton volumes. 1 hour only. I almost deleted it. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but the Collins Elite investigation had become an obsession, and I couldn't walk away from what might be my last chance at finding real answers. An hour later, I was in the basement of the manuscript collection, a building I'd never visited before. Roommate 47 was a cramped storage room filled with old books and filing cabinets. The Milton volumes were easy to find, a complete set of Paradise Lost editions dating back to the 1800s. Behind the books, taped to the back of the shelf, was a manila envelope. Inside was a single document that changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite. It was typed on official US government letterhead, dated August 12, 1969, and marked Eyes Only Collins Elite Termination Report. The document was brief but explosive. Memorandum for the record subject, termination of Collins Elite program. Effective immediately. All Collins Elite operations are suspended indefinitely. Program termination follows unanimous recommendation by Collins Elite senior staff. Reason for termination: successful entity infiltration of program hierarchy. Evidence suggests long-term entity influence over program direction since 1961. Collins Elite conclusions regarding entity nature remain valid. However, program itself has been compromised beyond recovery. All Collins Elite personnel are reassigned. All documents classified at highest levels. Religious community partnerships terminated. Interdenominational council dissolved. Public disclosure of Collins Elite findings is prohibited under national security provisions. Final assessment: the entities we sought to understand and counter have proven more sophisticated than anticipated. They have successfully used our own investigation against us, turning our knowledge into a tool for their agenda. The Collins Elite program has become part of the deception we were created to expose. Any future investigation of these phenomena must proceed under the assumption that traditional government and academic institutions are compromised. Minus Dr. Edward Collins, Program Director. I read the document 3 times before the implication sank in. Collins Elite hadn't just been terminated because of budget cuts or bureaucratic reshuffling. It had been terminated because the entities they were studying had infiltrated and co-opted the program itself. The Watchers had been turned into accomplices, and if that was true in 1969, what did it mean for every government UFO program since then? Sitting in that storage room, holding what might be the last authentic Collins Elite document ever created, I finally understood the true scope of what I'd uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't been a fringe program run by religious zealots. It had been a serious government investigation that reached a conclusion so disturbing that the entities being studied had been forced to destroy it. The program had gotten too close to the truth, so the truth had destroyed the program. But what was that truth? Based on everything I'd found, Collins Elite had concluded that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial contact, but rather the latest phase of an ancient psychological operation. Non-corporeal entities, call them demons, call them interdimensional beings, call them whatever you want, had been manipulating human belief systems for millennia. They had appeared as gods to ancient peoples, demanding worship and sacrifice. They had manifested as angels and devils to medieval societies, shaping religious doctrine. And now they were appearing as alien visitors to a technological civilization, promoting their agenda through the language of science and space exploration. The genius of it was that each generation thought they were encountering something new. Ancient peoples saw divine visitation, medieval believers saw spiritual manifestation, modern witnesses see extraterrestrial contact. But according to Collins Elite, it was always the same entities, always running the same basic deception, always working toward the same goal, the spiritual and psychological subjugation of humanity. The entities had realized that direct worship was no longer feasible in a scientific age, so they had adapted, presenting themselves as technologically advanced aliens who could offer humanity salvation through scientific advancement. Instead of demanding worship, they requested trust. Instead of requiring sacrifice, they asked for cooperation. But the underlying dynamic remained the same, humans giving up their autonomy to beings who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And if Collins Elite was right, the modern UFO disclosure movement was simply the latest phase of this deception campaign. The termination document explained why I'd never heard of Collins Elite in any mainstream UFO research. It wasn't being covered up by the government to hide alien contact. It was being covered up because the government itself had been compromised by the entities Collins Elite was studying. Think about it. Every major government UFO program since Collins Elite, Project Blue Book, AA-TIP, the UAP Task Force, had approached the phenomenon from a purely technological perspective. They studied craft capabilities, flight patterns, potential propulsion systems. They never asked the questions Collins Elite had been asking. What do these entities actually want? Why do their messages always promote dependence rather than independence? Why do their promises of enlightenment always require surrender of human agency? Those questions weren't being ignored by accident. According to the termination document, they were being actively suppressed by entities who had learned to work within government and academic institutions. The modern UFO research community, the disclosure advocates, the scientists studying anomalous aerial phenomena, they might all be sincere in their efforts, but they were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for extraterrestrial contact when they should have been looking for spiritual deception. And that meant that every major UFO revelation of the past 50 years might actually be part of the deception Collins Elite had tried to expose. I left that storage room with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. Collins Elite had tried to warn us, and we hadn't listened. Worse, we might not be capable of listening, because the entities they warned us about had apparently learned to control the conversation. Over the following weeks, I tried to verify the termination document through official channels. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I contacted government historians. I reached out to former intelligence officials. The responses were universally the same. No record of any program called Collins Elite existed in official government files. But that didn't mean the program had never existed. It just meant that someone had been very thorough in erasing it. The more I thought about it, the more the Collins Elite scenario made sense of things that had always bothered me about the UFO phenomenon. Why did entity messages always promote technological dependence rather than spiritual development? Why did alien contact always require humans to abandon their traditional belief systems? Why did every promised revelation turn out to be just another layer of mystery? According to Collins Elite, it was because the entities weren't trying to enlighten us. They were trying to control us. and the best way to control a technologically advanced species was to convince them that salvation could only come through higher technology, provided by beings who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart, the ancient formula updated for a scientific age. After finding the termination document, I thought my Collins Elite investigation was over, but 2 weeks later I received another cryptic email from the same archive. Recovery account. You found the termination report. Good. Now find the real archive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Georgetown University Theology Department. Tell her Marcus sent you. I almost ignored it. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I was already in too deep, that whoever was feeding me information might be leading me into something dangerous. But the name Marcus rang a bell. Marcus Whitmore, the author of that first 1963 thesis where I'd found the Collins Elite reference. Could he still be alive? Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the Georgetown campus, tucked between the main theology building and an old chapel. When I mentioned that Marcus had sent me, her reaction was immediate and alarming. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, and pulled out a device I later learned was a radio frequency detector. 62 years, she said quietly, sweeping the device around the room. 62 years Marcus has been waiting for someone to follow the trail far enough to find him. He's 91 years old and still afraid they're listening. Dr. Rodriguez led me through a maze of basement corridors beneath the theology building to a climate-controlled storage room I never could have found on my own. Inside, Marcus Whitmore sat surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they'd been moved there decades ago. He was ancient, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're the one asking about Collins Elite," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor tells me you found the termination report. That means they decided you were ready." They? The survivors. The ones who got out before the infiltration was complete. He gestured to the filing cabinets around us. "We've been maintaining our own archive for over 50 years. Everything the government tried to bury, we preserved. What Marcus showed me over the next 6 hours changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite, and about the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't begun as a government program at all. It had started in 1947 as an informal network of military officers, intelligence analysts and religious scholars who were disturbed by early UFO reports. What bothered them wasn't the craft themselves, but the messages being delivered by the entities inside them. The contactee movement was just getting started, Marcus explained, pulling out files from the late 1940s. George Adamski, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, all these people claiming contact with benevolent space brothers. But when you analysed their messages from a theological perspective, they weren't promoting human spiritual development. They were promoting dependence. The early Collins Elite had conducted detailed analyses of contactee messages and found disturbing patterns. The entities consistently promoted several key themes: the inadequacy of human religion, the necessity of technological advancement, the benefits of surrendering human decision-making to superior beings, and the dangers of independent spiritual development. It was the same psychological framework used by every cult in history, Dr. Rodriguez added. Isolate the subject from their support systems, convince them that traditional sources of guidance are inadequate, then position yourself as the only reliable source of truth. But Collins Elite's analysis went deeper than simple cult mechanics. They had identified specific linguistic and conceptual patterns that appeared across different contactee cases, patterns that matched historical accounts of demonic deception dating back thousands of years. Marcus showed me a 1952 analysis comparing Adamski's alleged conversations with Venusian beings to transcripts from 16th century witch trials. The parallels were undeniable. The same promises of secret knowledge, the same dismissal of conventional morality, the same emphasis on the chosen status of the contactee. That's when we knew we were dealing with something ancient, Marcus said. These weren't aliens from space. They were the same entities that had been manipulating human belief systems since the beginning of recorded history. By 1957, Collins Elite had attracted official government attention. The CIA and military intelligence was struggling to understand the UFO phenomenon from a technological perspective, but Collins Elite was approaching it from an entirely different angle, and getting results. We could predict contactee behaviour patterns, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We could identify which cases were likely to be genuine entity contact versus hoaxes or psychological episodes. We could even predict what messages the entities would deliver in future contacts. This predictive ability had made Collins Elite invaluable to government agencies dealing with UFO incidents. But it had also made them a target. Marcus pulled out a thick file labelled Entity Response Patterns, 1958 to 1961. Inside were dozens of reports documenting how UFO activity and contactee experiences changed in response to Collins Elite investigations. Whenever we got too close to exposing their methods, they would shift tactics, Marcus said. Study their linguistic patterns too closely, and suddenly contactees would start receiving messages in completely different styles. Document their technological claims, and they would start demonstrating entirely different capabilities. The entities weren't just running a deception campaign, they were actively monitoring the investigators and adapting their approach in real time. But the most disturbing pattern was personal targeting. Collins Elite members began experiencing their own anomalous encounters, but these experiences were clearly designed to discredit or manipulate the investigators, rather than provide genuine contact. Dr. Edward Collins himself was contacted in 1960, Marcus revealed. The entity claimed to be from Rigel and offered to provide him with advanced technology in exchange for shutting down the Collins Elite program. When he refused, the encounters became increasingly threatening. Other Collins Elite members reported similar experiences, contact attempts that seemed designed to either co-opt them or drive them out of the program entirely. The entities were fighting back. The termination document I'd found told only part of the story. The real disaster began in 1961 when Collins Elite was formally incorporated into the government's UFO investigation apparatus. That was our mistake, Marcus said bitterly. We thought official recognition would give us more resources, better access to witness testimony, protection from entity retaliation. Instead, it gave them access to us. With official status came new personnel assignments, government oversight, and integration with other classified programs. Collins Elite's small, tight-knit network of trusted researchers was suddenly flooded with new members whose backgrounds couldn't be thoroughly vetted. The infiltration was subtle at first, Dr. Rodriguez explained. New analysts who would subtly shift the focus of investigations, administrative personnel who would lose crucial documents, supervisors who would redirect resources toward more promising lines of inquiry. By 1965, original Collins Elite members were reporting that their research conclusions were being systematically altered before reaching higher-level officials. Analyses emphasizing the deceptive nature of entity contact were being rewritten to focus on potential technological benefits. Warnings about spiritual manipulation were being deleted entirely. Marcus showed me internal memos from 1966 to 1968, documenting the growing suspicion among original Collins Elite members that their program had been compromised. They began conducting parallel investigations using secure channels, trying to determine whether the infiltration was the result of foreign intelligence operations, bureaucratic incompetence, or something more sinister. By 1968, we had our answer, Marcus said grimly. It was the entities themselves. They had learned to work through human intermediaries, people who might not even be consciously aware that they were being influenced. The evidence was subtle but damning. New Collins Elite personnel consistently made decisions that served entity interests, redirecting investigations away from deception analysis, promoting contactees who delivered pro-entity messages, suppressing research that exposed manipulation tactics. The final proof came when Dr. Collins tried to present his findings to the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1969, Dr. Rodriguez said. His presentation was completely rewritten between the time he submitted it and the time it was delivered. Instead of warning about entity deception, it recommended increased cooperation with UFO intelligences. That was when the original Collins Elite members realized their program had been completely subverted. The Watchers had become the watched, and the watched had become the watchers. Rather than fight a battle they couldn't win within government channels, the original Collins Elite members made a radical decision. They would fake the program's termination while secretly continuing their research through private channels. The termination report you found was genuine, Marcus explained, but it wasn't the end of Collins' elite. It was the beginning of the real investigation. Using their existing contacts within religious institutions, academia and government, the Collins elite survivors established a covert network for continuing their research. They couldn't publish their findings or seek official recognition, but they could continue gathering evidence and developing their understanding of the entity deception campaign. We've been operating continuously for over 50 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, documenting entity activity, analysing their evolving strategies, tracking their infiltration of various institutions. The underground Collins elite had identified several key developments since 1969. The entities had largely abandoned individual contactee operations in favour of influencing institutions directly. Rather than delivering messages through isolated individuals who could be easily dismissed, they were now working through respected scientists, government officials and religious leaders. They had also shifted their primary narrative from spiritual enlightenment to technological salvation. Instead of promising cosmic consciousness or spiritual advancement, they were now focusing on environmental solutions, clean energy, and space exploration. Most significantly, they had begun preparing for mass disclosure rather than gradual revelation. The underground Collins elite believed this represented the final phase of a deception campaign that had been in development for decades. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez walked me through 50 years of documented entity influence on human institutions. The pattern was consistent but sophisticated. Entities never directly controlled human behaviour, but they influenced it through carefully orchestrated synchronicities, technological inspirations, and strategic information releases. Look at the development of computer technology, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me files documenting unusual technological leaps in electronics and computing since the 1960s. Every major breakthrough happened shortly after UFO encounters involving personnel who were in positions to influence research directions. The entities weren't providing blueprints or direct technological assistance. Instead, they were inspiring specific lines of research, guiding human scientists toward discoveries that served long-term entity interests. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have made humanity more connected but also more controllable, Marcus observed. They've created systems that can monitor and influence human behaviour on a global scale. According to underground Collins elite analysis, the entities had been systematically encouraging the development of technologies that would make mass psychological manipulation easier, while simultaneously making individual privacy and independence more difficult. But the most disturbing revelation was their analysis of the modern UFO disclosure movement itself. Every major disclosure advocate, every government whistleblower, every scientist calling for serious UFO research, we've documented anomalous encounters in their backgrounds, Dr. Rodriguez said. They're not consciously working for the entities, but they're all promoting the same basic narrative, that UFO contact is inevitable, beneficial, and should be embraced rather than resisted. The underground Collins elite had identified specific psychological themes being promoted through disclosure advocates: the inadequacy of human civilization, the necessity of outside intervention, the benefits of technological advancement over spiritual development, and the dangers of resistance to contact. It's the same message the contactees were delivering in the 1950s, Marcus said, just delivered through more credible sources and backed by more sophisticated evidence. According to the underground Collins elite's analysis, the current disclosure campaign was preparation for something unprecedented: open entity contact with humanity as a whole, rather than selected individuals. They've spent 70 years testing human responses, refining their approach, identifying the most effective manipulation strategies, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Now they're ready to scale up. The evidence they showed me was circumstantial but compelling. Government UFO programs consistently focused on technological aspects while ignoring behavioural and psychological elements. Scientific studies of anomalous phenomena emphasized physical measurements, while dismissing witness testimony about entity motivations. Media coverage promoted wonder and excitement about potential contact, while discouraging analysis of entity intentions. They're engineering consent, Marcus said, creating a cultural context where open contact will be seen as humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence rather than submission to a superior intelligence. The underground Collins elite believed that formal contact would be presented as humanity's invitation to join a galactic community, with entities offering technological solutions to environmental problems, social conflicts, and resource limitations. The offer would seem generous, beneficial, and desperately needed. But according to their analysis, acceptance would come with costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The gradual replacement of human decision-making systems with entity-guided alternatives, the erosion of individual agency in favour of collective efficiency, and the redefinition of human spiritual development to align with entity objectives. It won't feel like conquest, Dr. Rodriguez said. It will feel like salvation, right up until the moment humans realise they've traded their freedom for security, and they're no longer capable of making that trade in reverse. After hours of reviewing evidence and analysis, I asked the obvious question: if the underground Collins elite was right about entity intentions, what could be done to counter them? Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances before Marcus answered carefully. Individual resistance is possible but difficult, he said. The entities rely on collective consent and institutional cooperation. They can't force contact on humans who genuinely reject it, but they can make such rejection seem irrational, antisocial, or harmful. The underground Collins elite had developed what they called spiritual inoculation, techniques for recognizing and resisting entity influence. These included traditional religious practices like prayer and meditation, but also more analytical approaches, questioning the source and motivation behind any message promoting dependence, examining whether proposed solutions increased or decreased human agency, and maintaining strong connections to human community and traditional wisdom. The entities are masters of isolation and dependency, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their influence is weakest when humans are connected to each other and to their own spiritual traditions, and strongest when individuals feel cut off from community and traditional sources of guidance. But individual resistance wouldn't be enough if the entities succeeded in achieving mass consent for contact. The underground Collins elite believed that their most important function was preserving and disseminating knowledge about entity deception methods, so that future generations would have the tools needed to recognize and resist manipulation. That's why we've maintained this archive, Marcus said, and why we're sharing it with you now. The disclosure campaign is accelerating, and we may not have much time left to prepare people for what's coming. As I write this, the UFO disclosure movement is reaching a crescendo. Government officials are admitting that anomalous aerial phenomena are real. Military personnel are testifying about encounters with craft displaying impossible capabilities. Scientists are calling for serious study of the phenomenon. The public is being prepared for some kind of revelation. But if Collins' elite was right, that revelation might be the culmination of a deception campaign that began thousands of years ago. Think about how perfectly the current disclosure narrative fits the Collins elite framework. We're being told that non-human intelligence has been monitoring humanity, that these beings possess technology that could solve our energy and environmental problems, that contact is inevitable and potentially beneficial. We're being encouraged to view disclosure as a positive development, a step forward in human evolution. But what if it's actually the final step in a plan that began when the first human looked at the sky and wondered if the gods were watching? The entities Collins' elite studied had thousands of years to perfect their understanding of human psychology. They knew that direct domination would eventually fail, that humans would rebel against obvious tyranny, but they also knew that humans could be convinced to surrender their autonomy willingly, if the surrender was framed as enlightenment or advancement. The promise of godhood had worked for ancient peoples, the promise of salvation had worked for medieval societies, and the promise of technological transcendence might be working on us right now. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez had given me a framework for understanding the entity deception campaign, but they also gave me something more practical, a list of specific indicators that the final phase was beginning. We've been tracking these markers for decades, Dr. Rodriguez explained, showing me a comprehensive timeline of predicted developments. When all of them align, it means the entities believe humanity is ready for open contact. The first indicator was mainstream media normalization of UFO phenomena, not just reporting on UFO incidents, but actively promoting the idea that contact would be beneficial. According to their analysis, this phase had begun in earnest around 2017 and was accelerating rapidly. The second indicator was government disclosure of UAP reality without disclosure of government conclusions about entity intentions. They're admitting the phenomena are real, while carefully avoiding any discussion of what the entities actually want, Marcus noted. This creates public curiosity without public wariness. The third indicator was increased entity activity designed to demonstrate technological superiority while maintaining plausible deniability. The recent UAP videos released by the Pentagon fit this pattern perfectly. Clear evidence of advanced technology, but no direct communication or obvious threat. The fourth indicator was the emergence of credible advocates for contact within scientific, military, and government institutions. People with impressive credentials and no obvious ulterior motives, all promoting the same basic message: that humanity should welcome contact rather than fear it. Look at the current disclosure advocates, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me biographical information on various scientists and former government officials. Impressive backgrounds, sincere motivations, reasonable arguments, but they're all promoting the same narrative the entities have been pushing for 70 years. The fifth and most disturbing indicator was the systematic suppression of research into entity psychology and motivations. While technological aspects of UAP were receiving increased attention and funding, questions about entity intentions were being dismissed as unscientific or irrelevant. That's how you know the entities are controlling the conversation, Marcus said. Any investigation that might reveal their true agenda gets discredited or defunded, while investigations that support their preferred narrative receive institutional support. According to their tracking system, all 5 indicators were currently active and accelerating. The underground Collins elite believed this meant humanity was within years, possibly months, of formal entity contact. Before I left Georgetown that day, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You need to understand what you're walking into," he said quietly. "Everyone who's gotten this deep into Collins elite research has faced the same choice. Drop the investigation or accept that your life is going to change in ways you can't predict or control." He told me about colleagues who had been discredited through carefully orchestrated academic scandals, researchers who had lost funding after questioning entity motivations, investigators who had experienced personal crises that conveniently redirected their attention away from UFO phenomena. The entities don't usually resort to direct intimidation, Marcus explained. It's much more effective to make resistance seem personally costly. Failed relationships, career setbacks, health problems, family conflicts, all timed to coincide with getting too close to the truth. He showed me files documenting the life trajectories of dozens of Collins elite researchers over the past 50 years. The pattern was consistent. People who backed away from the investigation generally experienced improved circumstances, while those who continued faced escalating personal difficulties. "I'm not trying to scare you off," Marcus said, "but you need to know that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The entities have a vested interest in controlling what humans believe about them, and they've had centuries to develop sophisticated methods for managing troublesome individuals." Dr. Rodriguez had faced similar pressures. Her tenure at Georgetown had been threatened twice due to budget constraints that mysteriously resolved themselves when she temporarily reduced her Collins elite research. Her marriage had ended during a period of intensive investigation into entity influence on religious institutions. Her health had suffered during the years she was most actively documenting entity deception patterns. "But here's the thing," she said. "The difficulties are real, but they're not insurmountable. The entities can make resistance costly, but they can't make it impossible. If they could simply eliminate troublesome humans, Collins elite would never have existed in the first place." She believed that entity limitations were precisely why the deception campaign was necessary. If entities could control human behavior directly, they wouldn't need to spend decades engineering consent for contact. The fact that they relied on manipulation suggested that human free will, while vulnerable to influence, remained fundamentally intact. Over the following months, Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other members of the underground Collins elite network. I was amazed by both the size and diversity of the group. Theologians and physicists, former intelligence analysts and current religious leaders, retired military officers and active researchers. What united them wasn't a shared background or ideology, but a shared conclusion that the UFO phenomenon represented a spiritual threat masquerading as a technological opportunity. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic exorcist based in New Mexico, had been documenting parallels between UFO encounters and demonic possession for 30 years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had identified specific psychological patterns linking modern abduction accounts to historical accounts of spiritual deception. Colonel James Patterson, retired, former Air Force intelligence, had spent decades analysing UFO incident reports and concluded that entity behaviour was consistent with psychological warfare rather than scientific exploration. Each member of the network brought specialised knowledge and perspective, but all had reached similar conclusions about entity motivations and methods. More importantly, all had experienced some form of pressure or retaliation for their research, confirming the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity influence extended far beyond individual contactee cases. "We're not conspiracy theorists," Dr. Walsh explained during one of our meetings. "We're researchers who followed the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion. The UFO phenomenon is real, the entities are real, but their intentions aren't what they claim to be." The network had developed sophisticated methods for secure communication and information sharing, operating on the assumption that their activities were being monitored by both government agencies and entity-influenced individuals within those agencies. "We have to assume that any information we share through normal channels will be compromised," Colonel Patterson explained. "But we also can't become so paranoid that we stop sharing information entirely. The entities benefit from our isolation more than our communication." As my involvement with the underground Collins elite deepened, I learned that the network extended far beyond the United States. Religious leaders in Europe, researchers in Asia, indigenous spiritual authorities in South America, all were reporting similar observations about entity activity and deception patterns. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for me to speak with several international contacts via encrypted communication channels. Their perspectives added crucial context to the Collins elite analysis. Brother Antonio Mendez, a Spanish monk who specialized in mystical theology, had been tracking entity influences on contemporary religious movements. His research suggested that entities were actively promoting syncretistic spiritual practices that emphasized cosmic consciousness over traditional religious authority. "They're not attacking religion directly," he explained through a translator. "They're subtly altering it, encouraging beliefs and practices that make humans more receptive to entity guidance and less connected to traditional sources of spiritual wisdom." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher studying anomalous phenomena in Buddhist contexts, had identified similar patterns in Asian spiritual communities. Entity influences seem designed to promote meditation practices that open practitioners to external guidance, while discouraging those that strengthened individual discernment and spiritual independence. Maria Santos, a shaman from Peru, described entity encounters that closely paralleled North American UFO contact reports, but framed in terms of traditional indigenous spirituality. The entities consistently promoted abandonment of ancestral traditions in favour of updated spiritual practices more suitable for the modern world. "Same spirits, different masks," she said simply. "They tell each culture what that culture wants to hear, but always with the same goal: make humans depend on them instead of their own traditions and wisdom." The global perspective confirmed the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity activity was coordinated across cultures and belief systems, but adapted to local contexts and expectations. The deception campaign wasn't centered in any particular country or religion. It was targeting human spiritual independence as a universal phenomenon. Based on decades of analysis and current trends, the underground Collins elite had developed a timeline for what they believed would be the final phase of the entity deception campaign. Phase 1, 2020 to 2025, mainstream normalization of UFO phenomena through government disclosure and media coverage. Emphasis on technological aspects while avoiding discussion of entity psychology or motivations. Gradual preparation of public consciousness for the possibility of contact. Phase 2, 2025 to 2030. Increased entity demonstrations designed to showcase technological capabilities and benevolent intentions, possibly including solutions to environmental or energy crises that humanity appears unable to solve independently. Growing public pressure for government contact initiatives. Phase 3, 2030 to 2035, formal contact between entity representatives and human governments. Presentation of comprehensive assistance packages addressing climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts and technological limitations. Initial agreements for limited cooperation and information exchange. Phase 4, 2035 to 2040. Gradual integration of entity guidance into human decision-making systems. Replacement of traditional political, economic and social structures with entity-recommended alternatives. Growing human dependence on entity technology and advice. Phase 5, 2040 plus. Complete transformation of human civilization according to entity specifications. Elimination of independent human spiritual development in favour of entity-directed consciousness evolution. Humanity's transition from independent species to managed resource. The genius of the timeline is that each phase will seem like humanity's choice, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People will vote for leaders who support contact. They'll demand access to entity technology. They'll embrace changes that make their lives easier and more comfortable. Marcus nodded grimly. By the time humans realize they've traded their freedom for security, the infrastructure for independence will have been dismantled. They'll be completely dependent on systems they don't understand, controlled by entities they trusted. The timeline wasn't inevitable, according to Underground Collins' elite analysis, but it was highly probable unless humanity developed widespread awareness of entity deception methods and conscious resistance to manipulation. That's why we're talking to you, Marcus said, and why we've been talking to researchers like you for 50 years. Information is the only weapon we have against this kind of psychological operation. After months of research and analysis, I found myself facing the same choice that every Collins elite researcher had faced since 1947. Accept the implications of what I'd learned, or find a way to dismiss it as paranoid speculation. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. The pattern was consistent but complex. The implications were staggering but difficult to prove conclusively, and the personal costs of continued investigation were becoming increasingly apparent. My freelance work had dried up mysteriously. Dr. Martinelli had stopped returning my calls after someone complained about my misuse of university resources. My relationship was suffering under the strain of the long hours spent on research I couldn't fully explain. My sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of conversations I'd never had. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd learned. If Collins' elite was even partially correct, then humanity was walking into the most sophisticated trap in recorded history. And if that trap succeeded, future generations would live in a world where human independence was not just restricted, but literally unthinkable. The choice, ultimately, was between personal comfort and collective responsibility, between individual security and species survival, between the easy path of accepting official narratives and the difficult path of questioning everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. I chose to continue the investigation. It's been 6 months since my first meeting with Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez, and I'm no longer the same person who stumbled across that footnote in a theological dissertation. The evidence I've gathered has convinced me that Collins' elite was not only real, but correct in their fundamental assessment of the UFO phenomenon. We are not being visited by benevolent space brothers seeking to help humanity evolve to a higher level of consciousness. We are being manipulated by entities that have been perfecting deception techniques for millennia, entities that view humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be assisted. The current UFO disclosure movement, whatever the sincere intentions of its individual advocates, is serving entity interests by preparing humanity to welcome contact rather than question it. The technological solutions being offered through various contact scenarios are not gifts, but baits in an elaborate trap that will close once humanity becomes dependent on entity guidance. And the most terrifying aspect is that it's working exactly as planned. Public opinion is shifting in favour of contact. Government agencies are admitting UFO reality while avoiding UFO psychology. Scientific institutions are studying technological aspects while ignoring behavioural patterns. Religious leaders are embracing cosmic spirituality while abandoning traditional discernment practices. We are being prepared for our own subjugation, and we are enthusiastically participating in the preparation process. But knowledge of a deception campaign, even a sophisticated one, provides power to resist it. The entities Collins' elite studied were powerful and cunning, but they were not omnipotent. Their influence depended on human ignorance, isolation, and consent. When humans understood their methods and refused to cooperate, entity influence diminished significantly. The underground Collins elite has spent 50 years documenting entity weaknesses as well as their strengths. They've developed techniques for recognizing and resisting manipulation. They've maintained networks of communication and support that entity influence cannot completely penetrate, and most importantly, they've preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost or corrupted. That knowledge is now available to anyone willing to look for it, question official narratives, and think independently about humanity's future. The choice between freedom and security, between independence and dependence, between human agency and entity guidance remains open. But that choice won't remain open forever. According to every timeline the underground Collins elite has developed, we are rapidly approaching the point where collective consent for entity contact will make individual resistance increasingly difficult and ultimately ineffective. The time for choosing is now. The information needed to choose wisely exists, but it requires effort to find and courage to accept. The consequences of choosing poorly may be irreversible. 60 years ago, Collins' elite tried to warn us. Today, their successors are still trying. Whether humanity listens and whether we choose wisely remains to be seen. But the warning has been delivered. The evidence has been presented. The choice is ours. Maybe that's why you never hear their name in congressional hearings or disclosure reports, because Collins' elite wasn't warning us about aliens. They were warning us about faith in the wrong thing, and how easily it can damn us. The question isn't whether Collins' elite really existed. The question is whether they were right. And if they were right, then everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon might be part of the very deception they tried to expose. The entities they described have had 60 years to perfect their strategy since Collins' elite was terminated. 60 years to learn how to work within our institutions, shape our research, and guide our conclusions. 60 years to make sure that when disclosure finally comes, we'll welcome it with open arms. Because that's what good servants do, they welcome their masters home. But servants can choose to be free. The question is whether they will make that choice while they still can. That's tonight's deep dive into the Collins elite. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon and asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of contact itself. What do you think? Was Collins' elite a real government program, or just an elaborate piece of disinformation? And either way, are the questions they were asking the ones we should be asking now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep sleep theories going, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what's hidden in the footnotes of history. Until next time, sleep well and question everything.